The morning Josephine Brooks stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas. She had exactly $4.32 in her coat pocket, a worn leather trunk that had belonged to her mother, and a letter from a matchmaker named Mrs. Clara Voss that promised a good man, a solid house, and a future worth building, none of which Josephine was entirely certain she believed in anymore. The year was 1878, and the dust of the Panhandle settled over everything like a second skin. Redemption Creek was the kind of town that looked like it had been dropped from a great height onto the flat, sun-scorched earth and simply stayed where it landed. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that went by the name of the Copper Spur, a small white church that tilted slightly to the left, and 24 buildings in varying states of either being built up or falling apart. The October wind came off the plains like a blade, and Josephine pulled her coat tighter as she looked down the length of the main street and thought, quietly and without drama, that she had made a terrible mistake. She had come from Missouri, from a small farming town called Harlow, where the soil was good, but the prospects for a 24-year-old woman without a father or brothers, or any living male relative willing to vouch for her, were approximately none. Her mother had passed in the spring, a quiet death after a long fever, and the house they had rented for 11 years was no longer available to Josephine once the landlord understood there was no man left in the family. She had worked as a seamstress. She had taken in laundry. She had done everything a woman in her position was expected to do, and it had not been enough. It never was. Mrs. Clara Voss had come to Harlow in the summer, setting up her little operation in the back room of the millinery shop with a cardboard sign and a very confident smile. She arranged marriages, she said. Practical arrangements between sensible women and eligible men out west who needed wives and had the land and the means to provide for them. Josephine had sat across from Mrs. Voss for 45 minutes while the older woman looked her over the way a horse trader looks at a mare, and then Mrs. Voss had smiled and said she had just the man. His name was Elijah Whitfield, and he ran a cattle ranch about 3 miles east of Redemption Creek. He was 30 years old. He owned the land outright. He had a house with 4 rooms and a well that did not run dry. He had never been married. He had also, according to Mrs. Voss, sent back every single letter she had written him over the past 2 years. Every profile, every introduction, every carefully worded correspondence from every woman who had expressed even a mild interest in becoming Mrs. Whitfield. He had sent them all back unopened, or if opened, with nothing more than a single line written across the bottom in a firm, slanted hand. Not interested. Return to sender. Josephine had asked why Mrs. Voss thought he would be any different with her. Mrs. Voss had smoothed her skirts and said, with considerable confidence, that she had a feeling about it this time. That had not been an especially satisfying answer, but Josephine was 24 years old and alone in the world, and the alternative was going back to laundry and an uncertain room in a boarding house, so she had said yes. Now she stood on the plank sidewalk of Redemption Creek with her trunk at her feet, and a man was walking toward her from across the street in a way that suggested he had been watching the stagecoach arrive and had not particularly wanted to be there for it. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall in the way that some men from that part of Texas were tall, like the land itself had something to do with it, like growing up under that enormous sky had given them extra inches to fill it. He wore a dark hat, trail-worn and practical, and a coat the color of dried tobacco leaf. His boots were dusty. His jaw was set in a hard, straight line that Josephine had seen on men who had decided before arriving that things were not going to go well, and his eyes, when he finally stopped in front of her and she could see them properly, were a clear, pale gray that reminded her of creek water in winter. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "You're the woman Mrs. Voss sent." It was not a question. It was barely even an acknowledgement. It was the kind of statement a man made when he was confirming something unpleasant. "I am," Josephine said, "Josephine Brooks, and you are Elijah Whitfield, I expect." He took off his hat, which was manners, and put it back on again, which was habit, and said, "I need to tell you something before this goes any further, Miss Brooks." "All right," she said. "I did not write to Mrs. Voss asking her to send anyone. I have not written to her at all. She took it upon herself to send you here, and I had no knowledge of it until her last letter arrived 3 days ago saying you were already on the stagecoach. I am sorry you have traveled this far. I will pay for your return journey." Josephine looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. She said, "Mrs. Voss told me you had rejected every letter she sent you for 2 years. That is correct. And then she sent me anyway without your agreement. That appears to be the situation." Josephine was quiet for another moment. She was not, by nature, a woman who panicked. She had learned a long time ago that panic used up energy she could not afford to waste. She looked up the street and then down it. She looked at the tilting white church. She looked at the general store with its barrels out front. She looked at Elijah Whitfield and said, "I have $4.32, Mr. Whitfield. If you want to send me back to Missouri, you will need to cover the stage fare because I cannot. And I have nowhere to return to. I gave up my rooms before I left." He stared at her. He had not expected that. She could see it in the way his gray eyes shifted, the way a slight furrow appeared between his brows. He said, "You gave up your rooms before knowing whether I would accept you." "Mrs. Voss seemed very confident," Josephine said, which was true, if not especially illuminating as to the wisdom of the decision. Elijah Whitfield put his hands on his hips and looked out over the flat horizon for a moment, his jaw working slightly, and then he looked back at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite pity and was perhaps, Josephine thought, something closer to resignation. "There is a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Elijah Hatch," he said. "I will cover your room there for 2 weeks while we figure out what is to be done. You should not have been put in this position, and I will not leave you standing in the street." "Thank you," Josephine said. "Do not thank me," he said. "This is not a good situation for either of us." "No," she agreed, "but it is the situation we have." He picked up her trunk, which surprised her. She had expected him to have someone else do it, and carried it himself down the sidewalk toward the boarding house. She walked beside him. Neither of them spoke. The wind came across the plains and pulled at her hair, which she had pinned up carefully for the arrival, and she thought, "Well, this is what the Wild West looks like in practice." Mrs. Elijah Hatch was a stout woman of about 50 with sharp eyes and a soft voice, and the kind of efficiency that came from having managed things alone for a long time. Her husband had died 6 years before, she told Josephine, helping her up the narrow stairs to a small but clean room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the back lot and a quilt that smelled like cedar. She had kept the house going herself, with a girl who came in for the heavy washing, and she had 6 rooms that she let out. "Mr. Whitfield is a good man," Mrs. Hatch said, setting a pitcher of water on the washstand. "He does not say much, but he is decent. He runs a fair operation out there. His father built the Whitfield Ranch from nothing, and when he died 8 years ago, Elijah kept it going. Better than going, honestly. He has expanded it. He works hard." "He did not want me here," Josephine said, not unkindly, simply as a fact. Mrs. Hatch gave her a look that was knowing and somewhat amused. "He does not want much of anything, that man. It is his nature. He holds himself in, but holding yourself in and wanting nothing are not the same thing." She patted the quilt. "Dinner is at 6. I make a good beef stew." Elijah did not come to dinner that night. He had left her at the boarding house door, told her he had a ranch to run, and ridden east on a dark roan horse before she had even gone inside. Josephine ate Mrs. Hatch's very good beef stew and listened to the other boarders. A traveling merchant named Gerald Potts and a young schoolteacher named Miss Ruth Abernathy, who had arrived 2 weeks before to take up the position at the Redemption Creek School, and she gathered what information she could about the town and the man and the situation. Ruth Abernathy was 22, bright-eyed and earnest, and she was delighted to have another woman arrive. She told Josephine everything she knew about Redemption Creek in the time it took to eat a bowl of stew and half a slice of cornbread, which was considerable. There was a drought that had been going on for 2 years, she said. Several smaller ranchers had already sold or abandoned their land. The big ranches were holding on, but the tension in town was thick because a man named Vernon Crail, who owned the largest single piece of property to the north, was buying up whatever he could get and pushing people out in ways that were not always strictly legal. The sheriff, a man named Hogan, was either unable or unwilling to do much about it, depending on who you asked and what they thought of Crail's money. And Mr. Whitfield? Josephine asked. Ruth lowered her voice slightly, though Gerald Potts was deep in his own thoughts at the other end of the table. He has had trouble with Crail. Crail has been trying to buy him out for 2 years. The Whitfield land sits between Crail's northern holding and the creek, the real one, not just the name, and Crail wants the water access. Mr. Whitfield will not sell. There was a bad incident last spring, I heard, with some of Crail's men and Whitfield's fence lines. Nothing that came to gunplay, but close enough. Josephine filed this away. She had grown up in a farming town, and she understood what water meant and what men would do for it. She slept that night in the clean, cedar-smelling room and listened to the wind move across the plains outside and thought about Elijah Whitfield's gray eyes and the way he had picked up her trunk without being asked. He came to the boarding house the next morning. She was in the small parlor that Mrs. Hatch let the boarders use, sitting by the window with her mending. She had brought her sewing kit, which had been, she thought, one of the smarter decisions she had made, when she heard his voice at the door and then his boots on the floorboards. He sat down in the chair across from her, hat in his hands, and looked at the floor for a moment before looking at her. I spoke to Mrs. Voss by telegram this morning, he said. Oh, Josephine kept her eyes on her mending. She said she sent you because, and I am quoting here, you were the first woman she had spoken to in 2 years who she thought had the character for the Whitfield ranch. She also said she would not cover return passage because she believes this is the right match and she intends to stand by it. Josephine bit off her thread and looked up. That is very presumptuous of her. Yes, he said. He turned his hat in his hands. I want to be honest with you, Miss Brooks, because I think you deserve that. I have sent back Mrs. Voss's letters because I am not in a hurry to marry. I have the ranch. I have what I need. I have not felt the lack of company in a way that made me want to do something about it. I understand, Josephine said. However, he said and paused. She waited. However, I am also a fair man, I hope. And the fact is that you are here and you are in a difficult position that is not of your making, and I have enough room at the Whitfield ranch to— He stopped again. I am making a mess of this. A little, Josephine agreed and surprised herself by almost smiling. He looked at her sharply, and something passed across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite pleasure but was somewhere in that territory. What I am trying to say is this. You need a position. I need a cook and someone to manage the house, which I have been doing badly on my own for 8 years. I have 2 hired hands and a cook's position that I have not filled since my last cook left in the summer. I am proposing a working arrangement, not a marital one. You would live at the ranch, cook and keep the house, be paid a fair wage. That gives you time to find your footing and figure out what you want to do. It gives me a cook. It is practical. Josephine set down her mending. She looked at Elijah Whitfield, his dusty boots and his careful hands and his gray eyes that were watching her with something that was working very hard to be purely businesslike and not entirely succeeding. That is a sensible proposal, she said. I accept. Something in his shoulders came down half an inch. Good, he said. I will come for you tomorrow morning. I have to ride out to the north pasture today. There is a fence situation that needs attending. The fence with Crail's men, she asked. He looked at her. Mrs. Hatch talks freely. Miss Abernathy, Josephine said, but I imagine most of the town knows. Yes, he said, and there was a tightness around his mouth that told her the situation with Crail was worse than a fence dispute, but that he was not ready to say so. I will be here at 7 tomorrow. He was there at 6:55 with a wagon and the dark roan horse tied behind it, and he loaded her trunk with the same quiet efficiency he had the day before, and they drove east out of Redemption Creek in the early morning light, with the sun coming up red and enormous over the flat land. The Whitfield ranch was not what she had imagined, which was to say it was better. She had pictured something rough and bachelor spare, functional and grim. What she found instead was a property that had clearly been cared about. The house was solid, built of good timber, with a covered porch that ran across the front and a kitchen garden on the south side that had gone to end-of-season wildness, but showed in its bones that someone had once tended it seriously. Inside, the rooms were clean enough for a man living alone, which meant they were not dirty, but they were not particularly organized either. There were books on a shelf in the front room, real books, several of them which she had not expected. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. There was a kitchen with a good iron stove and pots that had been scrubbed. "My mother kept the garden," Elijah said when he caught her looking at it from the kitchen window. "She died when I was 22. I have not done much with it since." "I can do something with it in the spring," Josephine said before she could think better of the implication. She meant it practically. A kitchen garden was practical, but she heard in her own voice that she was already thinking about a spring here. She did not look at him. He showed her the house. Her room was at the end of the hall, the one that had been his mother's, he said, and he had put fresh bedding on the bed that morning. It was a good room, with a proper door and a window that faced east. She thanked him. He said it was nothing. The two hired hands were brothers, Tom and Charlie Reeves, 26 and 23 respectively, weather-beaten and good-natured, who tipped their hats at her and went back to whatever they had been doing with the focused energy of men who are slightly afraid of a woman's opinion. She found that charming. The first week was careful and polite, and full of the particular tension of two people who have been placed near each other, and are not yet sure what to do with the proximity. Josephine cooked. She was a good cook. Her mother had been an excellent cook, and the difference between her meals and whatever Elijah had been doing for himself was immediately evident in the way Tom and Charlie ate, which was with a gratitude that bordered on devotion. Elijah ate without comment for the first 3 days, which she did not take personally because she had already determined that silence was his primary mode of communication, and then on the 4th day he said, without looking up from his plate, "This is the best biscuit I have had in approximately 8 years." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield." He said, "You may as well call me Elijah. We live in the same house." She said, "Then you may call me Josephine." He nodded as though that was settled and went back to his biscuit, and it was, she thought, one of the more intimate conversations they had had thus far. She found small things about him that she was not supposed to notice and noticed anyway. He read in the evenings after supper in the chair by the fire. He read seriously, with real attention, not the way some men read to be seen reading. She had worked up the courage to look at the shelf, expecting almanacs and cattle ledgers, and found instead a worn copy of David Copperfield, a translation of Don Quixote, 3 volumes of natural history, and a book of poems by Alfred Tennyson that had been read so many times the spine had softened completely. She took out the Tennyson, which she had never read, and he came in from the barn that evening to find her at the kitchen table with it open in front of her. He stopped in the doorway for a moment, and something moved in his face that he did not say. "I hope it's all right," she said. "I should have asked." "Read whatever you like," he said. "That is what books are for." She read him a line because the impulse came from somewhere she did not entirely control. She read, "I hold it true, whate'er befall. I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." She heard herself read it and felt heat come up in her face, because it was an awfully pointed thing to read to a man who had spent 2 years refusing to be matched. But Elijah sat down across the table and looked at the space between them and said, quietly, "I know that poem. I have read it many times." She did not ask what he thought about it. Some things needed room to breathe before they could be said. The trouble with Vernon Crail came to a head on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November. Josephine was in the kitchen making a pie. She had found a cache of dried apples in the cellar and had soaked them overnight. When she heard raised voices from the yard and looked out the window to see 3 men on horseback at the edge of the property, and Elijah standing in the yard below, not on his horse, just standing there with his arms at his sides in a way that she had come to recognize meant he was controlling something very carefully. She dried her hands and went to the door. The man in front was not large, but he had the kind of presence that some men have when they have a great deal of money and a great deal of certainty about themselves. He had a neatly trimmed beard and a good coat and a voice that was used to being the loudest in a room even when it was not particularly raised. This was Vernon Crail. She knew it without being told. "I am making you a fair offer, Whitfield," Crail was saying. "Better than fair. More than this land is worth in this drought. You would be a fool not to take it." "I have told you my answer," Elijah said. His voice was flat and steady as the horizon. "Your answer is not good business thinking. You are holding on to principle and you will lose the whole thing to the bank eventually if the rain does not come. I am offering you an exit before that happens." "I am not going to the bank," Elijah said. "My land is not mortgaged." "Not yet," Crail said, with the smile of a man who believes he has information you do not. "Mr. Crail," Josephine said from the porch, because something in that smile made her jaw set, "would you like some coffee?" Both Crail and Elijah turned to look at her. Crail's expression shifted from the smile into something assessing and curious. Elijah's expression was unreadable, but his gray eyes found hers, and there was something in them not quite warning, but something specific. "I was not aware Whitfield had a woman at the house," Crail said, with the particular falseness of a man acting pleasanter than he feels. "Josephine Brooks," she said. "I keep the house. Can I offer you coffee, gentlemen?" Crail looked from her to Elijah and back, and his smile changed. It was the kind of smile that was working out something useful. "No, thank you, Miss Brooks. We were just leaving." He touched his hat brim. "Think about what I said, Whitfield. The offer has a time limit." They rode off. The dust they raised in leaving was slow to settle. Elijah stood in the yard a moment longer and then came up onto the porch. He stopped beside her and they both watched the road where Crail and his men had gone. "You did not need to come out," he said. "I know," Josephine said, but he was smiling in an unpleasant way and I thought a third presence might change the tone. A beat of silence. "It did," he said. She nodded and went back inside to her pie. That evening, after supper, Elijah did not sit with his book. He sat at the kitchen table instead, with the ranch ledger in front of him, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had been sitting with something difficult. She poured him a second cup of coffee and set it down without making a thing of it, and after a moment he said, "My father's land ran to nearly 1,200 acres at its widest. I still have 800. Crail has already acquired the rest, not from us, from neighboring parcels that were sold when the drought started. The creek that runs through the eastern edge of my property is the only reliable water source left in this part of the county. That is what he wants, not the land, the water." "And he cannot simply divert the creek?" she asked. "He would need my land to do it." "The creek runs through a narrow point on my eastern boundary, and if he could cut that off and redirect it north, toward his holdings, he could effectively starve every other piece of land down here of surface water. He would own the water in this county." Josephine thought about this. She thought about the people in Redemption Creek who had already sold, the small ranchers and farmers who had moved on because the drought had made holding on impossible. She thought about what it would mean if one man controlled the water. "He cannot be allowed to do that," she said. Elijah looked at her. "No," he said, "he cannot." "Then you need to make sure you can hold on," she said, "legally. Is there a territorial land office? A water rights record?" He stared at her for a moment that was longer than a moment, and then reached back to the shelf behind him and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I have the original deed and the water survey from 1861. My father filed everything properly, but the Territorial Records Office is in Abilene, and I have not had the chance to go in 2 years because I cannot leave the ranch that long without." He stopped. "Without someone to manage things here," she said. The silence between them was of a different quality than it had been before. Something in it had shifted, had become aware of itself. "Tom and Charlie can manage the cattle," he said carefully. "I need 3 days to ride to Abilene and file the water rights formally. If I register the claim properly at the territorial level, Crail cannot touch it regardless of what he buys around me." "Then go," she said. "I can manage the house." "It is a good deal to ask of you," he said. "I have been managing things on my own for quite some time," she said, not unkindly. 3 days and Charlie and Tom are on the property. I will be fine." He left 2 days later, on a gray Monday morning in late November, with his saddlebags packed and the water survey papers wrapped in oilcloth in his coat. He told Tom and Charlie to be available to her. He told her where the shotgun was, which was under the bed in his room, and that she was not to hesitate to use it if she had reason to, and she said she would not. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after all of that was said, with his hat in his hands again, and looked at her in a way that was trying to be practical and was not entirely succeeding. "I have left the ranch ledger on the shelf," he said. "If anything needs attention, Elijah," she said. He stopped. "I will be here when you come back," she said. "Go file your papers." Something in his face broke open, very briefly, and then closed again. He put his hat on, nodded once, and went out to his horse. She watched from the porch as he rode east toward the horizon until the distance swallowed him, and stood in the cold morning air for a moment after he was gone, and felt, with a clarity that slightly alarmed her, that she wanted him to come back. He was gone 3 days and a half. The half was because something went wrong with his horse's shoe 2 hours out of Abilene on the return trip, and he had to lead the horse on foot to the nearest settlement before he could ride back, which added half a day. She did not know this until he told her. What she knew was that he was supposed to be back on Thursday afternoon, and by Thursday evening he was not there, and by Thursday night she had rebuilt the fire twice, and was sitting in the front room pretending to read a book she was not reading when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She did not run to the door. She stood up with great dignity and walked to the door and opened it. He rode in by lamplight, and even from the porch she could see the tiredness in the way he sat. He dismounted, handled his horse, and came up to the porch. "Horse threw a shoe," he said. "I gathered something had happened," she said. "There is supper on the stove. It has been kept warm." He looked at her. His face in the lamplight was tired and something else, something that had been thinking about coming home to her light in the window and had not let itself think that and thought it anyway. "Did you file the papers?" she asked. "I filed the papers," he said. "Water rights are registered at the territorial level in my name, signed and sealed. Crail can buy every inch of land between here and the county line, and it will not change a thing about that creek." "Good," she said, and felt ridiculously like crying, which she would not do. "Come inside, you look frozen." He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table and ate the supper she put in front of him, and she sat across from him with her hands around a cup of tea, and they did not say much. But the silence was warm in a way that silence between them had not been warm before. It was the silence of two people who have been apart and are glad to be in the same room again. She realized, in that kitchen, with the fire going and the wind outside and Elijah Whitfield eating her cooking across the table from her, that she was in trouble. The practical kind, which was the worst kind because it had no clear remedy. She had not come here to fall in love. She had come here to survive. And the man across the table from her had spent 2 years sending back every letter, which meant he did not want this, did not want someone to miss him while he was gone and feel ridiculous about it, did not want someone to sit by his fire reading his Tennyson and thinking about the careful way he said her name. She put her cup down and said good night and went to her room. December came and the frost came with it, settling over the plains in the early mornings in a thin white sheet that burned off by mid-morning. The work of the ranch changed in December, less riding out, more repair work, the constant management of hay and feed, and the cold weather needs of the cattle. Elijah was around the property more, which meant he was around the house more, which meant Josephine found herself existing in a state of continuous careful attention to not looking at him when he came in from the cold with frost in his hair and color in his face from the wind. Ruth Abernathy came to visit on the second Sunday of December, riding out with Tom Reeves, who had made it his particular mission to be near the schoolteacher whenever town business brought her out this way. Ruth was sharp enough to notice things, and within the first hour of sitting in Josephine's kitchen, she had noticed several of them. "He watches you when you are not looking," Ruth told her, in the absolute certainty of tone that 22-year-olds have about things they have observed but not yet had to navigate personally. "He did it 3 times while we were having coffee just now." "Ruth," Josephine said. "I counted," Ruth said. "And you do the same thing when he leaves the room. I noticed that too." "We are 2 people living in a practical arrangement," Josephine said. "Yes," Ruth said, with an expression that said she found this description insufficient. "That is very clear." After Ruth left, Tom Reeves very gallantly offering to ride back with her to make sure she got to the boarding house safely, which Ruth accepted with the kind of graciousness that suggested she had been expecting him to offer. Josephine went back to the kitchen and found Elijah at the table with a letter in front of him. "From Mrs. Voss," he said. He held it out. She took it. Mrs. Voss's round handwriting covered 2 pages in a cheerful, unapologetic script. She asked how they were getting on. She said she was glad the arrangement had been made. She said at the bottom of the second page that she hoped they would find, as she had always believed they would, that the practical and the personal were not as separate as people like to think. Josephine set the letter down on the table. "She is a meddling woman," Elijah said. "She is," Josephine agreed. "She is also not entirely wrong about things." The quiet that followed was a different kind of quiet. It was aware of itself, in a way that made the air in the kitchen feel thick with all the things that were not being said. Elijah stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the cold yard and the barn and the frozen garden and said, with his back to her, "I sent her letters back because I was not interested in a woman who would come here for a house and a secure position." "I understand," Josephine said carefully. "I told myself I was not interested in marriage. That was the easier explanation." He paused. "The truth is that I was not interested in the version of it that Mrs. Voss was selling, which was practical compatibility and a well-managed household." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I have a well-managed household now, Josephine, and it is not what makes me." He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. He was a man who had spent years keeping things inside, and the habit was fighting the impulse very hard. She waited. She had learned his silences well enough now to know when one was carrying something and when to let it carry it to where it needed to go. "It is not what makes me glad you are here," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the plain in a long, cold wave. "What does make you glad I am here?" she asked, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes that she had thought, on the day she arrived, were like creek water in winter, and she thought now that she had been right, but that she had not known then how much warmth could live in creek water in winter if you put your hands in it and held still. "You," he said. "Just you." She stood up from the table. She was not sure what she intended to do, but she crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and he stood very still, the way he did when he was controlling something carefully, and she looked up at him and said, "I did not come here to fall in love with you, Elijah Whitfield." "No," he said, "I expect you did not. I came here because I had $4.32 and nowhere to go. I know. And I am telling you this so that you understand it is not gratitude or necessity or anything to do with position that is making me say that I have spent the last 6 weeks trying very hard not to look at you and have been entirely unsuccessful." Something happened in his face then, something that cracked the careful, controlled surface of it wide open, and it was not a small thing. It was the expression of a man who has been holding himself in for a very long time and has just been told by someone he trusts that it is safe to stop. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, the way a man touches something he has wanted to touch for a long time and has been afraid of getting wrong, and she turned her face into his hand the way a flower turns toward the sun without deciding to, and he said, very quietly, "Then stop trying." She stopped trying. The kiss was careful, and then it was not careful, and then she was standing in the winter kitchen with her face in her hands afterward, not because she was upset, but because she needed a moment to hold herself together, and he was standing near her very still, and then he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was warm and a little helpless, and it made everything in her chest rearrange itself permanently. She looked up at him. "I have been a fool," he said. "You have been cautious," she said. "For 2 years I sent back letters from women I had never met and told myself it was because I was not ready, and the truth is I was waiting for something specific and I did not know what it was." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her with his warm Winter Creek eyes and said, "Now I know." Christmas came to Redemption Creek that year with a thin, cold brightness that made the flat land look like hammered silver in the mornings. Josephine and Elijah drove into town on the Sunday before Christmas to attend the church service in the tilting white building, which had been straightened somewhat by the congregation putting their collective weight against the east wall, and she sat beside him in the pew and felt the warmth of him along her side, and thought that this was the best Christmas she had had in at least 4 years, which was saying something because her mother had been alive 4 Christmases ago, and her mother had been the best part of any Christmas. Mrs. Hatch spotted them from across the church and gave Josephine a look of thorough satisfaction. Ruth Abernathy was 2 rows up with her hands folded and her expression serene, and when she turned around she gave Josephine one swift wide-eyed look that said everything without saying anything. Tom Reeves, sitting near Ruth with an expression of bovine happiness, noticed none of this. Charlie Reeves noticed but kept it to himself, which was, Josephine had come to understand, very much Charlie's way. After the service, Vernon Crail was in front of the church. He saw them emerge together, saw the way they stood close, the way Elijah's hand was at the small of her back without it being a conscious decision, and his expression went through something complicated before settling on a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Whitfield," he said, "and Miss Brooks, I hear congratulations may be in order." "You hear a great deal, Mr. Crail," Josephine said pleasantly, "for a man who lives 3 miles north." Crail's smile thinned. He looked at Elijah. "I have revised my offer. I would like to discuss it at your convenience." "My answer has not changed," Elijah said, "but I will tell you something that may be of use to you. The water rights on the Eastern Creek are now registered at the Territorial Office in Abilene. They are a matter of public record. You may verify this yourself if you choose." The smile left Crail's face entirely. What was left behind was a harder thing, and Josephine watched it and understood that Crail was dangerous not because he was violent, particularly, but because he was the kind of man who did not accept a closed door as an answer. He found other doors. "That is interesting," Crail said very quietly. "It is also final," Elijah said. "Good day, Mr. Crail." They drove home through the silver bright afternoon, and the plains opened up around them, enormous and clean, and Josephine sat close enough to Elijah that their shoulders touched and neither of them moved away. "He will not let it alone," she said. "No," Elijah agreed, "but the legal ground is solid now. He cannot take the water rights. He can make things difficult, but he cannot take them." "What kind of difficult?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Crail has a man who rides for him named Price. He has caused trouble for smaller operations before, nothing that could be directly connected to Crail, but there have been accidents on properties that have held out against him. A barn fire here, a broken fence that lets cattle drift in bad weather." Josephine thought about this with the careful attention she gave to problems. "Then we need to make sure there is nothing that looks like an accident available to him," she said. Elijah looked at her sideways. "Check the barn," she said. "Make sure nothing is sitting around that could cause a fire if someone helped it along. Keep the fences in the best repair you can manage." And she paused. "Do you have any friends in town? People who would act as witnesses if something happened?" he thought. "Ben Holly's at the general store has no love for Crail. He has watched 3 of his suppliers get pushed out. and the Reverend Jacobs is a fair man who hears things." "Good," she said. "People who can bear witness matter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn to think like this?" "My mother," she said simply. "She managed our situation entirely alone for the last 12 years of her life. She taught me that the way to protect what you have is to think 3 steps ahead of whoever might want to take it." He nodded slowly, as if adding this to a picture of her he was continuously revising. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Josephine said, and felt the familiar quiet grief of it, the kind that does not hurt as acutely as it did but never entirely stops. "She would have liked the ranch. She would have liked the garden in spring." "Then we will make it worth her approval," Elijah said, with a seriousness that meant he was thinking about spring. He was thinking about her being here for spring. She looked at him. The afternoon light was turning everything gold along the horizon, and the dry grass moved in the wind, and it was, she thought, the most beautiful place she had ever seen, and 6 weeks ago she had thought she had made a terrible mistake. He proposed on New Year's Eve. It was not a grand thing. There were no flowers, because it was January in Texas, and the land was not producing flowers. And there was no ring yet because the silversmith in Redemption Creek was closed for the holiday. It happened in the kitchen, which is where most of the significant things between them had happened, and it happened like this. He came in from checking the cattle in the early evening, and she was making a soup from the last of the smoked ham and some dried beans she had found, and he stopped in the middle of the kitchen and said, "Josephine." She turned around. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because it is practical, though it is. Not because you keep the house well, though you do, but because I am a better version of myself when you are in this house, and I do not want to be any other version again." She put down the spoon she was holding. She looked at him, this tall, quiet, careful man who had spent 2 years sending back letters and then had not sent back hers, and felt something in her chest that was so full it was almost painful. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her in a way that was thorough and certain, and she laughed against his mouth, and he laughed too. And outside the new year was coming in over the plain with a cold, brilliant sky full of stars. And it was the first hour of 1879, and Josephine Brooks was going to be a Whitfield. Mrs. Clara Voss received the telegram 3 days later, and by all accounts from those who were in the Harlow telegraph office when it was delivered, read it standing up with an expression of absolute vindication that she did not attempt to conceal. The wedding was in February, in the tilting white church in Redemption Creek that had been further corrected in the new year by the addition of 2 support beams on the east side. Reverend Jacobs performed the ceremony. Ruth Abernathy stood up with Josephine in a dress that Mrs. Hatch had helped alter for the occasion. Tom Reeves stood up with Elijah and looked more nervous than the groom. Charlie Reeves sat in the front pew and cried quietly, which he denied afterward to everyone who asked, unsuccessfully. Ben Hollies from the general store attended. Mrs. Hatch attended. The Reverend's wife attended with her 3 children. 14 people in the church and the cold February sun coming through the high windows, and Josephine in a dress that had been her mother's, let out at the waist and shortened at the hem, standing next to Elijah Whitfield, who was wearing a clean shirt and his best coat, and looking at her as she walked up the aisle with an expression so unguarded and open that she had to focus very carefully on not weeping. She did not weep. She saved it for later, alone in the barn while seeing to the horses before supper, because she was not a woman who cried in public if she could help it. And she cried then for her mother, who had not seen this, and for the 24-year-old woman who had stood on the plank sidewalk in October with $4 in a trunk and thought she had made a terrible mistake, and because being allowed to have something good after a long time of not having much that was good at all was its own kind of grief. The sweet kind that came up beside the happiness. Elijah found her in the barn. He came in quietly and found her with her face turned into the neck of the roan horse and did not say anything for a moment, just put his hand on her back. "I'm all right," she said, muffled against the horse. "I know," he said. "I just needed—" "I know," he said again. Take your time." She turned around and wiped her face on her sleeve, which she knew was not dignified, and he looked at her with his gray eyes and did not comment on the lack of dignity at all, just gave her his handkerchief. She took it, she used it. "I was thinking about my mother," she said. "She would have been glad today," he said. "Yes," Josephine agreed. "She would have been very pointed about what took us long enough." He smiled at that, the warm, slightly helpless smile that she had been collecting since the first time she heard it, and held out his hand. And she took it, and they walked back to the house in the cold February evening, which had turned the sky above the plain every color from orange to deep purple in the way that Texas evenings had of being extravagant and showing off. Spring came slowly, the way springs come after hard winters, grudgingly at first and then all at once. The drought, which had held the county in its grip for 2 years, broke in March with 2 weeks of steady rain that filled the creek to its old width and brought the dormant grasses up in a green so vivid against the brown plains that it seemed almost wrong, too much, like a promise that had been broken for so long people had stopped expecting it to be kept. Josephine put in the kitchen garden. She started with the herbs her mother had always kept: sage and rosemary, and the mint that would get ahead of you if you did not manage it firmly, and then expanded into vegetables, squash and beans, and the long rows of corn that Elijah told her the soil on the south side was particularly good for. He helped her on the Sundays, kneeling in the dirt in his good clothes because he had not thought to change, digging out the hard winter soil with his hands, and she thought that this was one of the things she loved most about him, that he would kneel in the dirt in his good clothes without a thought because she was doing it, and that was sufficient reason. They fell into the life of the ranch together the way 2 rivers fall together, each one shaping the other's banks. She learned which cattle had distinct personalities. The old brindle cow that Tom called Empress, and that was indeed imperious, and the young bull that would follow Charlie around the south pasture if Charlie had something in his pockets, which Charlie usually did. She learned the weather signs that Elijah read in the sky and the grass and the behavior of the horses, the building green in the southwest that meant a serious storm was coming, the particular quality of stillness that came before bad weather. She learned that he woke up at 4:30 every morning without an alarm and was quiet for the first hour, not unhappily but by nature, needing the silence to assemble himself for the day, and she gave him that silence without making a thing of it because she had figured it out by the 3rd week, and because she had some of the same need herself. He learned her. He learned that she thought most clearly in the mornings and was less sharp after 8 in the evening, so the conversations that mattered were better had before supper. He learned that she kept her worries to herself until they had become fully formed thoughts, because she hated saying something half figured out and then having to revise it, which meant that sometimes she went quiet for a day or 2 on something, and it was not unhappiness, it was thinking. He learned that she would fight any battle that needed fighting without hesitation, but hated conflict for its own sake, and that she had strong opinions about certain things that she held quietly and absolutely, and that if she expressed an opinion about something it was because she was certain about it. He learned, most importantly, that she was not a woman who needed to be managed or protected in the way that some men imagined women needed protecting, and that what she needed from him was trust and company and the certainty that he was not going anywhere, which was the one thing he was completely certain he could give her. The trouble from Crail came in April. It was not barn fires or broken fences in the end. It was legal. Crail found a surveyor from the county office who produced a document claiming that the original 1861 survey of the Whitfield land had an error in the eastern boundary, which, if corrected, would place a significant portion of the creek outside Whitfield property, and therefore outside the water rights registration. Elijah came home from town with the papers and his jaw set in the hard, straight line that she had not seen on him since October, and he spread the survey documents across the kitchen table, and she looked at them and then looked at him. "Is the original survey wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. I have the original documents. The boundary markers are still standing. But Crail has a surveyor willing to say otherwise, and if this goes to the county court, it will be a surveyor's word against my father's 1861 documents. Who decides? Josephine asked. The county judge. Judge Walters, Elijah said. He is not a dishonest man, but he is in Crail's social circle, and I cannot predict what he will do with competing evidence. Josephine sat down and looked at the papers. She thought about her mother, who had always said that the way to protect what you have is to think 3 steps ahead. She thought about the land office in Abilene. She thought about the territorial registration. The water rights are registered at the territorial level, she said. Not the county level. Even if the county survey is disputed, the territorial registration is a separate document. Can Crail challenge a territorial registration through a county court? Elijah stared at her. I don't know, he said. I would need to talk to someone who knows territorial law. There is a lawyer in Abilene, she said. Ben Hollies mentioned him last month. He helped the Garner family with their land dispute. His name was Nichols. Elijah was already on his feet. I will go tomorrow. I will come with you, she said. He opened his mouth and she looked at him and he closed it again. Yes, he said, all right. They rode to Abilene together, which took 2 days, and they spent the first night at a way station that was rough but serviceable. And they lay in the dark in the small room listening to the Texas night sounds, coyotes in the far distance, the wind in the scrub. And she put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they were comfortable in a way that was still, she thought, somewhat miraculous. The way some things that have become familiar remain miraculous because their familiarity is itself the miracle. Are you afraid, she asked, of losing the ranch? He considered. I am not afraid for myself. I am afraid for what my father built. He spent 20 years on that land. He believed in it. We will not lose it, she said. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. You always say things like that. Because they are usually true, she said. The lawyer Nichols turned out to be a precise, careful man in his 50s who had handled enough land disputes in the Texas territory to know his way around the relevant law. He read the documents carefully, asked pointed questions, and then looked up from the papers with an expression of professional satisfaction. The water rights registration at the territorial level supersedes any county survey dispute, he said. This is established precedent from the 1873 Land Act. A county court has no jurisdiction to challenge a territorial registration. Whatever Crail's surveyor produces for the county judge is irrelevant to the water rights. The most he can do is dispute the boundary itself, which might affect a small strip of grazing land but cannot touch the creek access. He wrote a letter on their behalf to the county judge in Redemption Creek, citing the relevant statute, and charged them $4.50, which Josephine paid from her household budget because she had been managing the household budget since February with a careful eye and had a small reserve. Elijah looked at her when she paid. She said without looking up, "It is our household." On the way home, he reached across the wagon seat and took her hand and did not let go of it for approximately 7 miles, which she counted because it was a thing worth counting. The county court case dissolved within a week of the lawyer's letter arriving at Judge Walters' office. Crail made one more attempt, a personal visit to the ranch in May that went differently than the November one, because Josephine met him on the porch with the direct, calm authority of a woman who knows exactly where her legal ground is and is not 1 inch off it. "Mr. Crail," she said, "you are welcome to the water in the creek for your cattle's drinking, as you always have been. What you are not welcome to is a private diversion of that water for irrigation of your north fields at the expense of every other property downstream. The territorial water rights make that clear, and I suspect your own lawyer has told you as much. So if you have come here with a new survey, I am afraid you have wasted a trip. But if you would like to discuss a cooperative water-sharing arrangement that benefits both properties fairly, my husband is in the barn and I will fetch him." Crail looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the house behind her, the clean porch and the kitchen garden starting to come in on the south side, and something in him seemed to calculate and recalculate. "You are not what I expected," he said, which was not quite a compliment but was not a hostility either. "No one ever is," Josephine said pleasantly. Crail left. He did not come back. His man Price was seen in town less and less as the summer came on, and by July the word through Redemption Creek was that Crail had turned his energies north, toward a different county where the water rights situation was less settled. Whether this was true or he was simply repositioning, the immediate pressure on the Whitfield ranch eased like a hand unclenching. Summer on the Whitfield ranch was full of work and heat, and the particular deep satisfaction of things growing. The kitchen garden was extraordinary. The rain that had ended the drought had filled the soil with a richness that produced squash the size of a man's forearm, and corn so tall it cast real shade in the mornings. Josephine preserved everything she could, filling the cellar shelves with jars of tomatoes and pickled beans and dried corn, and the smell of the kitchen in August was the best thing she had ever lived inside of. Ruth Abernathy and Tom Reeves announced their own engagement in June, which surprised no one in Redemption Creek, including Tom, who had been building toward it since the first Sunday he had offered to ride her home from church. The wedding was set for September. Josephine made Ruth's dress, which was white muslin with small blue embroidered flowers at the collar and cuffs, and it took 3 weeks and was the best piece of sewing she had done since her own mother had taught her. In August, she was certain enough to tell Elijah. She told him in the kitchen, because the kitchen was where they had all their important conversations, and she told him in the evening when the light came in at a particular angle through the west window and turned everything warm. She said, "I think I am going to have a baby in the spring." He put down the cup he was holding. She watched his face go through something that was not language, that was wider than language, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her mouth, with a tenderness that was so concentrated it made her eyes fill with tears, which she did not attempt to contain this time. "Are you well?" he asked, pulling back to look at her with an expression that was joy and alarm in roughly equal parts. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Stop looking at me like I am about to break." "You are not going to break," he said firmly, as if deciding it, "but you are going to do less of the heavy work in the garden." "Elijah, Josephine," he said with equal firmness. They looked at each other. "Within reason," she said. "I will do less within reason." "That is all I ask," he said, which was not entirely true but was what he said. He was, in the months that followed, somewhat ridiculous about it. Not in a stifling way, he had too much respect for her independence to try to wrap her in wool and keep her off her feet, but in a way that was evident in small, constant attentions. He came in for the mid-morning break, specifically to check on her, when before he had taken his break in the field. He repaired the porch step that had been slightly loose for 2 months, which she had told him about once and not mentioned again. He drove to town once a week rather than once a fortnight and came back with things. A particular kind of tea that Mrs. Hatch had told him she liked. A book from the traveling merchant that came through Redemption Creek. A length of good wool in a deep green that she had looked at in the general store window one afternoon without mentioning it to him. She came home from visiting Mrs. Hatch one afternoon in September to find the wool on the kitchen table with a note in his careful handwriting that said, "For the cold months ahead." She held it for a long moment and then pressed her face into it and stood in the kitchen being entirely ridiculous about a length of wool, which she was allowed to be. Ruth and Tom's September wedding was warm and bright, and full of the kind of happiness that comes from a community that has had enough of hard years, and is glad to celebrate something that is straightforwardly good. Josephine wore the green wool made up into a dress that she had sewn herself and that fit beautifully, and she stood beside Ruth while Tom Reeves took his vows with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck, and she looked across at Elijah, who was standing next to Tom and who caught her eye over the length of the church and gave her a look that was private and specific and entirely for her. She thought, I am going to remember this for the rest of my life. Not the church particularly, though the church had been straightened now and the light was very good. Not the dress, though the dress was lovely. The look on his face. The fact of being looked at like that, across a room, by the particular person who has become the center of your life. October came and the anniversary of her arrival, which she only realized when she was lying awake in the early morning dark and counted back through the months. 1 year since she had stood on the plank sidewalk with $4 and her mother's trunk and a letter that promised a good man. She had not believed in the letter. She had been right to be skeptical about the letter, she thought, and wrong about almost everything else. She got up carefully and went to the kitchen in the pre-dawn quiet. She lit the lamp and put the coffee on and sat at the table in the morning stillness, and after a few minutes she heard Elijah's feet on the boards of the hall, the quiet, careful step that was so familiar it was part of the rhythm of the house. He came into the kitchen and looked at her. "You could not sleep?" he asked. "I was thinking," she said. He poured his coffee and sat down across from her, and the lamp made a warm circle around them in the dark kitchen, and outside the Texas plains were enormous and silent and full of stars. "A year ago today," she said, "I got off the stage in Redemption Creek." He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about it too." "What have you been thinking?" He was quiet for a moment, which was usual, and she waited, which she had learned to do, and then he said, "I have been thinking about the man I was a year ago, who had spent 2 years sending back letters because he had convinced himself he was fine on his own, who went to meet a woman he had not asked for with the full intention of sending her back too. And," she said, "and I am grateful," he said. "Every day, I am grateful I did not." She reached across the table and he turned his hand over and took hers, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the coffee and the dark morning and the ranch quiet outside, and it was one of those moments that are not dramatic but that are the substance of a life, that are what a life is actually made of beneath and between all the things that happen in it. "I am grateful too," she said, "for all of it, even the $4.32. He smiled at her, the warm, helpless smile she collected, and said, "Mrs. Voss will expect a great deal of credit." "Mrs. Voss," Josephine said, "is going to get more credit than she deserves, and she will be insufferable about it, and it will be entirely worth it." He laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and the coffee was good, and the stars outside were enormous. The baby was born on a Saturday in late March, which was, as Josephine had privately noted, the anniversary of her mother's death almost exactly, which felt like something, though she was not superstitious and did not say so to anyone. Mrs. Eleanor Hatch came out to the ranch to help, along with the doctor from Redemption Creek, a steady man named Dr. Fuller, who had been delivering babies in this part of Texas for 15 years. It was a long labor and not easy, as first labors tend not to be, and Josephine was, at certain points during it, very direct about her opinions of the process, which Mrs. Hatch received without comment and Dr. Fuller received with professional calm. It was a boy. Elijah had spent the labor in the front room in a state that could only be described as barely controlled catastrophe, pacing from the window to the fireplace and back, Charlie Reeves having stayed at the house because neither Tom nor Charlie could stand the idea of Elijah being alone in it. When Dr. Fuller came out and said it was a boy and both were well, Charlie actually sat down on the floor, which was the response of a man whose legs had stopped working, and Elijah went very still for a moment and then said, "Can I go in?" in a voice that was not quite his usual voice. Dr. Fuller said he could. He came in and she was propped against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and she was, Elijah would say later, the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, which was saying something because he had seen a great deal of extraordinary country. She looked up at him when he came in and she was tired down to the bone and completely radiant, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was small and furious-faced and indignant about existing, and he put one finger into the baby's closed fist, and the baby held onto it with the automatic fierce grip of newborns, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked up at Josephine and said, "He is perfect." "He has your nose," she said. "He has his own nose," Elijah said. "He has not had it long enough to be anyone's nose." She laughed, which hurt somewhat, and he apologized, which she told him not to do. They named him Samuel after Elijah's father, Samuel James Whitfield, the James being for no one in particular, but because it went well with Samuel, and Josephine had always liked the name. Mrs. Hatch cried again when she heard the name, which she did every time something moved her and did not attempt to conceal. And Ruth Abernathy, who came out on Sunday to see the baby, held Samuel with the practiced care of a woman who had been a schoolteacher long enough to know how to hold something small and important, and said he was absolutely the handsomest baby she had ever seen, which Tom Reeves said was a high standard given that their own first child was coming in July. Summer came again. Samuel grew the way babies grow, which is to say alarmingly fast and in every direction. By August he was fat and loud and had definite opinions about most things, and Elijah carried him around the ranch in the mornings with a gravity and tenderness that undid Josephine every single time. This tall, quiet, careful man narrating the ranch to his son with the same seriousness with which he did everything, explaining the horses and the cattle and the garden, and the way the creek ran after the good rains. And Samuel regarded all of this with very large gray eyes that were his father's eyes, and with an expression of fierce concentration that was, unmistakably, his mother's. Ben Hollis told Josephine one afternoon in town that he had never seen Elijah Whitfield smile as often as he smiled now, and that the whole of Redemption Creek had noted the change, and that it was, he said, with the frankness of a man who has known someone for a long time, long overdue. She thought about this on the drive home, with Samuel asleep in her arms in a way that she had learned to balance against the wagon's movement, and Elijah beside her with the reins easy in his hands and the late afternoon light enormous and gold over the plain. She said, "Ben Hollis says you smile more." He was quiet for a moment. "Ben Hollis should attend to his own stock," he said, but there was something in his voice that was a smile being contained. "He is not wrong," she said. "No," Elijah agreed. "He is not." The year turned. Samuel took his first steps in October on the anniversary of Josephine's arrival, which she chose to take as the universe's way of underlining a point. He went from the chair leg to the table leg and back, 3 steps each way, with an expression of concentrated determination that made Tom Reeves say the boy was going to be a natural horseman, and Charlie Reeves say the boy was going to be president, and Elijah catch him at the end of his 3rd run and swing him up and look at him with an expression that needed no description. Mrs. Voss wrote in November. She had heard, through the network of contacts that matchmakers apparently maintained across considerable distances, that the Whitfield match had resulted in a marriage and a child, and she wrote to express her satisfaction in terms that were warm and completely free of any acknowledgement that she had sent Josephine across the country without the man's agreement, which Josephine found so characteristic of her that she could not help admiring it a little. She wrote back. She thanked Mrs. Voss for the meddling plainly, because it deserved to be called what it was, and then she said something honest, that she had arrived with $4 and a trunk and no certainty of anything, and that she was writing from the kitchen of a house that was full of the sounds of her husband and her son in the yard, and that she was, she believed, the most fortunate woman in Redemption Creek, Texas, and possibly the most fortunate woman she personally knew. She sealed the letter, and Elijah took it to the post on his next trip to town. 1980 was a good year, which Josephine noted with a private gratitude that she held carefully, having learned that good years were worth acknowledging fully precisely because they were not guaranteed. The ranch produced well. The rains had continued to come steadily since the drought broke, and the creek ran full and clean through the eastern boundary, and the water rights registration that Elijah had filed in Abilene was like a deed of security against the world. Crail had indeed redirected his attentions elsewhere, and there had been no further incidents, though Elijah kept the fences in careful repair and the water rights papers in a tin box in the good chest in the bedroom, because some precautions were worth keeping permanently. Tom and Ruth Reeves had a daughter in July, whom they named Clara, which Ruth said was for no particular reason, and which Josephine privately suspected was partly for Mrs. Clara Voss, though Ruth denied it when asked. Tom and Charlie both stayed on the Whitfield ranch. Tom had a small house built on the property's western edge that year, and Charlie kept his room in Redemption Creek but spent more time on the ranch than off it, attached to the family in the way that some people become attached to families not by blood, but by the accumulated weight of years and trust and shared work. Samuel, at 1.5, was conducting his own explorations of the ranch with the systematic thoroughness of a small person who believes everything requires investigation, and Josephine kept one eye on him approximately always, which was made easier by the fact that every member of the ranch's extended population also kept one eye on him approximately always, so that the child was at no point without surveillance, while also being under the impression that he was largely unsupervised, which suited him enormously. In the spring of 1881, Josephine told Elijah she thought they were going to have another baby. He took this news with the same mixture of joy and alarm that he had taken the first, minus perhaps 30% of the alarm, because he had survived the first time and knew that she was entirely capable of managing her own constitution. "Are you well?" he asked, which was his first question, and she had expected it. "Wonderfully well," she said. "Better than the first time, more settled." "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "What do you think it will be?" "I have no way of knowing that, Elijah," she said. "No," he agreed. "Of course not." Another pause. "What do you hope?" She considered this. Samuel was running across the yard outside with Charlie in determined pursuit of something that had escaped from the vegetable garden, a chicken, probably. There were always chickens getting into the garden. She watched them from the window, the small running figure and the tall one behind him, and felt the warmth of the scene settle into her. "Healthy," she said. "That is all I hope." "Yes," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him. He was watching her with the expression that was still, after 2.5 years, capable of rearranging things in her chest. The expression that was private and specific and entirely for her, and that she had first seen across a church at Tom Reeves' wedding, and that she had been collecting ever since, like the Tennyson poem, like the length of green wool, like all the things that were the substance of a life. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That a year ago I was standing on a sidewalk in this town thinking I had made a terrible mistake," she said. He came to her and stood close, the way he did, not crowding but present, and she leaned forward and put her forehead against his chest and felt his hands come up to her back. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Terrified," she said. "But I had $4.32 and nowhere to go, so there was not much to do about it." She felt him laugh, the warm, helpless laugh, felt it in his chest more than heard it. "I was afraid too," he said. She pulled back and looked at him. "Were you?" "When I rode out to meet the stage," he said. "I had already decided I was going to send you back. I had the speech ready. And then you got off the stage with your trunk and your coat and looked down the street like you were assessing the situation, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought, this woman is going to be trouble," he said. She stared at him. "The best kind," he said. "The irreversible kind." She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded, and he pulled her close and held her in the spring kitchen with the sounds of the ranch outside and their son's voice carrying clear across the yard, and the garden coming in on the south side, and the creek running full and steady on the eastern boundary of everything they had. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1881, with a full head of dark hair and her mother's eyes and her father's habit of regarding the world with a composure that seemed excessive for someone who had been alive for approximately 4 minutes. They named her Margaret Louise, for Josephine's mother, which made Mrs. Hatch cry in a way that was essentially ceremonial at this point, and which made Elijah, who had never met Margaret Brooks but felt he knew her from 2 years of hearing her daughter speak of her, look at Josephine with a gravity and tenderness that she would carry with her always. Samuel, at 2.5, regarded his sister with the considered uncertainty of a child who has been the center of a world and must now renegotiate the terms. He eventually decided, after approximately a week of deliberation, that she was acceptable, and was subsequently found on 3 separate occasions sitting very close to her basket and explaining the ranch to her, which was so clearly his father's approach to the situation that Josephine had to leave the room to compose herself. Life on the Whitfield ranch in the years that followed was not without difficulty. There was another dry summer in 1883 that tested the water stores, and there was a bad winter the year after that took 2 of the cattle and required the kind of sustained hard work that tested everyone. And there were years when the markets for beef went in directions that made the ledger numbers tight and required careful management. But the land was theirs, and the water rights were secured, and the house was full, and the life they had built on the Whitfield property was the kind of life that is made of 10,000 ordinary days that are, on reflection, not ordinary at all. Josephine's kitchen garden became something of a legend in Redemption Creek, partly because of its productivity, and partly because of her habit of sharing its surplus with anyone who needed it, which in practice meant that the widow Mrs. Hatch's table was better provision than her modest income would have suggested, and that the Reverend Jacob's household was never without vegetables in season, and that she kept a standing arrangement with Ben Holly's at the general store to take excess preserves in exchange for store credit, which worked well for everyone. Elijah expanded the cattle operation carefully over years, as the land and the conditions allowed. He was not a man who overcreached, which was one of the things she had come to understand was the bedrock of him, a patient, clear-eyed understanding of what was possible and what was not, and a willingness to work within what was possible with complete commitment. He hired 2 more hands as the herd grew. He repaired and improved the house room by room, including, in the summer of 1884, rebuilding the kitchen from scratch with a larger stove and a proper pantry that Josephine had been suggesting for 2 years, which he undertook with the focus and precision he brought to everything, and which resulted in the best kitchen in Redemption Creek, as Mrs. Hatch declared when she came to see it and walked through it with the expression of a woman genuinely moved by a pantry. Ruth and Tom had a second child in 1883, a boy they named James, and the 2 families were close in the way that neighbors become close on working land, bound by proximity and shared seasons, and the accumulated weight of watching each other's children grow up. Ruth continued to teach at the Redemption Creek School, which she had been doing since her arrival and had no intention of stopping, and the school had grown to 40 children by 1884 and had a second teacher hired to help, and Ruth had become quietly indispensable to the town in the way that certain women become indispensable by simply continuing to show up and do what needs doing. In the evenings after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, Josephine and Elijah sat by the fire in the front room. He read. She sewed or read herself, or simply sat with her hands in her lap looking at the fire and listening to the sound of the wind on the plains and feeling, every time, the same settled, specific gratitude that she had first identified on the night of his return from Abilene, when he had come home frozen and tired, and she had put supper in front of him, and the kitchen had been warm. One evening in December of 1884, the fire lit, the wind outside, Samuel and Margaret asleep down the hall, she looked up from the letter she was writing and found him watching her over the top of his book with the expression she collected. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking. About." He closed the book and set it on the table and looked at her with a directness that still, 6 years in, could stop her completely. About the man who sent back 2 years of letters, he said, and about what his life would look like right now if he had sent back one more. She set down her pen. She looked at the room around them, the fire, the bookshelves, the rag rug that she had made in the second winter with wool scraps, the children's drawings pinned to the wall beside the fireplace, his hat on the peg by the door, her good coat beside it. She looked at him. "Empty," she said. "Yes," he said, "empty." "But you did not," she said. "No," he said, "I did not." And that was the whole of it, really. That was the story, or at least the part that could be told in words, which was only ever part of any story. The rest of it was in the rooms of that house, and the acres of that ranch, and the creek that ran full on the eastern boundary, and in the particular quality of silence that existed between two people who have fully and irreversibly become part of each other's lives. The letters that Mrs. Voss had sent over 2 years came back to him unopened or with a single line. "Not interested. Return to sender." And then one autumn day in 1878, a woman had gotten off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, with $4 and a leather trunk and a letter that said there was a good man waiting, and he had walked across the dusty street to send her back too, and he had found instead that he was entirely wrong about what he wanted and entirely right about what he had been waiting for, which had been her, specifically, exactly her, and the particular trouble she would become. He had sent back every letter the matchmaker sent, until he did not. And in the kitchen of the Whitfield ranch, in the long sweet years that followed, with the plains enormous outside, and the children growing, and the garden coming in every spring, and the creek running steady on the eastern edge of everything they had built and kept and loved, Josephine Brooks, who was now, and would always be Josephine Whitfield, was glad, with a gladness that had no bottom and needed no words, that Mrs. Clara Voss was a very confident and entirely meddling woman who had sent her anyway.